We looked at Orientalism, we looked at the understanding of Orientalism and Neo Orientalism. We also looked at how these Orientalist discourses were produced in the West and led to the popularity of Indian religion, Hindu religion, yoga, meditation, and the Jugalbandi between Pandit Ravi Shankar and the Beatles. Now, let us look at some concrete examples of how India has been Orientalized in the Western imagination, and how the Orientalist discourse that we spoke about, the Indologist discourse or the Orientalist discourse that we spoke about, how it produced an image of India in the West, an image that persists to this date and carries over into Neo-Orientalism. So, we will see how these images of India were produced, and going with the colonialist myth of India, in the colonialist discourse of India, India is configured like other colonial settings as an empty space, as an antithesis to the West, and in the idea of India as representing nature as versus the culture which was represented by the West. So, India is the East, including India, is represented as mysterious, inscrutable, primitive, and because it's a blank space, there is an absence of people other than some people. And who are these people? We will look at those later. So, it exists as a landscape, an idyllic landscape, landscape of uncorrupted nature, pristine uncorrupted nature. It is also constructed through grand architectural objects. We said that the idea of India as an ancient Indian civilization which took a beating in the Middle Ages. So, this grandeur of India was constructed through the images of these grand architectural objects dating back to the Mughal era or even earlier, to show how India had interestingly, these were objects of the Mughal era, even though the Orientalists were creating an ancient India as a real India, or the India which had achieved greatness in the past. And the people we see, or we do see some people, but only certain kind of people, and these people, the individuals, the human beings that we see dotted in as dots in the landscape, are largely two kinds of Orientals, because the objective of Orientalism is to construct another who exists as an alterity to the West, as a difference to the West, and it is used by the Western self or the European self to construct itself. So, the two Orientals, the two forms of Orientals we find in these representations are, first the royals, and the others are the working class people, the servants, ayahs, and so on. And thirdly, we have images of women. So, why are these images being used of different kinds of Orientals? First of all, these are the kind of people officers or travelers or administrators would come into contact with. They would not really come into contact with the ordinary middle class. There was no middle class at that time. The ordinary people, the only contact they would have with Orientals in their day-to-day lives was the royals, who they confabulated with at meetings and formal gatherings, and in more intimately they were aware of their servants and people who the retainers. One important interesting aspect was of so on one hand we have the idea of the stereotype of the Oriental male as exemplified by the royals as tyrannical, savage, primitive, patriarchal, and then we have the exoticization of the women. So, in this ambivalent otherness that the West created or Europe created of its others, the female always acted as the object of the West's desire. So, it was the Westerners would come into contact with only with a certain kind of women, given the prevalence of this, the discourse of veiling and unveiling. They would not have access to ordinary women except to a certain kind of women, and these women were often the Notkers, for instance, they were exoticized. So, this exoticization of the Oriental female, which coexisted with the denigration of the Oriental male, were part of the Orientalist discourse, and which kind of embodied, which summed up this ambivalence they had towards the Oriental other, an object of both fascination and object of desire, as well as horror and terror. So, both these images are represented. Now, this discourse that we have, Orientalist discourse that has been produced in the West, was produced in the West of the Orient, of the East, particularly of India, of South Asia, was a discourse which was produced both by visual forms of representations as well as narrative forms. In this particular module, I would be focusing largely on the visual forms of representation, and close with the reference allusion to how there is a intersection between the visual and the narrative forms in the way the Oriental other or the Oriental landscape is represented in Western European representations of India during the British era. And we can see in this discourse a very exotic, very fascinating India, a stereotype of India of bazaars, as you can see in this image of the bazaar, or palaces, and you have elephants, images of elephants and kings riding on elephants. So, and snake charmers. So, those are the kind of people the British would normally come into contact with, and they were fascinated with them. They tended to exoticize them, and those were the images which first traveled and circulated in the West, creating a certain image of India, which I said persists till today. And even today, when Indian students go to the West, they are often asked by their college friends or university friends if they rode to their school on an elephant, or if they know any snake charmers. So, that stereotype of the Orientalist or stereotype of the East that was created in the West in the 19th century or even earlier persists till this date. So, the first the beginning of the discourse goes back. We've looked at the scholars who produced this discourse, the Indologist discourse, by studying the ancient texts and creating an interest in Indian philosophy, religion and literature. But other than the formal study of the text, we also have a number of European travelers, administrators and artists who traveled to India, and it is these European traveled who first created images of India which circulated in the West and which created a mystique of the Orient, a mystique of India that fascinated the West. But so, however exoticized this mystique might have been, it's a mystique which was based on certain stereotyped images of India, which are partly true, but not entirely true. And the way these images of India, these representations exoticized and romanticized the day-to-day life in India, became a way of representing India in the West, which persists till this date in all genres. So, the paintings of European travels produce this mystique of India through two kinds of paintings. So, first is the landscape painting and the other is the portraits. So, this trope of Varanasi, once again today we have the circulation of the trope of Varanasi, and for the Western tourist, Varanasi stands, it becomes an ethnocultural signifier of Hinduism and even of India, where it stands for mysticism, spirituality, and these images of Varanasi, the Ghats, were first produced by these European travelers. From there we move on to painting. We look at the paintings of these European travelers, and we see that there were about 30 British portrait painters trained in oil paintings and 28 miniaturists who traveled to India between 1770 and 1825. So, it started in the end of the 18th century, not in the 19th century, whereas the learning of Sanskrit, we said, went back even a century earlier with Roth's and the German scholar Roth's interest in Indian languages and literatures. Amongst the earliest European artists who visited India were John Zoffany, William Hodges, Tilly Kettle, William and Thomas Daniels, Emily Eden, and others. I wouldn't have time to show you all the paintings, but I have selected a few representative paintings of the painters to give you an idea of. We won't have time to go into the individual corpus of each painter again, but we will look at I'd quickly run through some representative images created by these portrait painters and miniaturists who created this, who participated in the production of this Orientalist discourse about India. So, from around 1760 till the mid 19th century, these itinerant artist travelers toured India working for local patrons, making paintings and prints of monuments, landscapes and portraits. So, they were first commissioned by local patrons, and let us look at some of these paintings. Now, these artists worked in oils and canvas, utilizing the Western technique of academic realism with its emphasis on linear perspective. So, this whole idea of perspective, the way space is arranged in Western, the monocular view of Western landscape, European landscape painting, it represented India in such a way, it represented India through this monocular perspective of the colonial master, the perspectival painting, which is very different from when we looked at the earlier paintings, and say when we looked at Hansanama, we found that the whole idea of perspective was lacking in the Indian painting. But what is important is it's the way Indian landscape was represented in these landscape paintings by these landscape painters who brought the techniques of Europe to India, the way the lens through which they viewed this through the Indian landscape as primitive, savage, or even the perspective they use, that became a way of represent India not only in the West, but also in the East. And my argument is that in the process of doing so, in the process of imposing these Western European aesthetics on the Indian landscape, these painters othered the landscape. So, they defamiliarized the landscape, which was represented as a surrounding space or a embracing space in the earlier forms of painting, which were one dimensional, the older schools of painting. For instance, the realist form of painting in the idea of perspective, they defamiliarized the landscape for Indians, but also gave them a model for representing India. So, today the images of India that we have, they date back, they originate in this style of presenting India. These European artists recorded the new colony in prints and paintings that explored the vast landscape, the numerous historical edifices and monuments, and the many communities that inhabited the land. So, what I am trying to say is that it's one always sees we have an India which is produced through the Western gaze. Okay. The idea of the production of India, the landscape as well as the people, through the eyes of the West or through the Western gaze, begins with Western European painting, and extends into the photograph. So, when India is looked at from the Western gaze, it has to conform to the Western stereotype of India as primitive, as savage, as uncivilized, as raw, as nature, and the people are also closer to nature. They are primitive, they belong to the pastoral era. So, if you look at these paintings, we find that the way the landscape is represented, or the choice of landscapes itself, there is a focus on landscapes or areas which represent India as a savage primitive land, or an ancient land, or a bustle, the images of crowds, the images of streets, the images of bazaars. So, they contribute to that myth of the inscrutable, mysterious India that we talked about earlier. So, filtered through the Orientalist lens, these works image India as exotic and mysterious in paintings. So, depicting the ghats of Benares, dancing girls in princely courts, colorful caste costumes, portraits of local rulers, certain kind of tribal people and their courtiers, and different native occupations in the local flora and fauna. So, I do not have a sample of Robert Sayer, who is one of the earliest European traveler artists to have painted India, who produced 6 engravings of early British settlements in India in 1754. But we have the next example is that of William Hodges, a very well known painter, whose exquisite paintings during early British rule in India slowly started to unfold itself in the hands of several of geniuses from England. Within the period of 1780 to 81, the Madras, first at Madras and then at Calcutta, William Hodges, who lived between 1744 and 1797, in the middle of the 18th century, produced a series of landscapes done in the picturesque idiom. They later appeared as a series of aquatints in his select views of India. So, you have this image of Benares first produced by Hodges, and we can see how the use of the picturesque in landscape painting produced a very exoticized, a very romanticized India. From here we move to Tilly Kettle. In June 1769, Tilly Kettle, who lived between 1735 and 1786, arrived in Madras as the first professional British painter, so even earlier than Hodges. He painted a number of portraits in Madras, and in 1770 a rather famous portrait of Muhammad Ali Khan, Nawab of Arcot. Within the period of 1771 to 1773, Kettle went on to visit the fort court of Oudh, then located at Faizabad, and welcomed by Shuja-ud-Dawla, Nawab of Oudh. Kettle produced 6 portraits of the Nawab and a charming picture of a dancing girl during his stay. He also painted Indian ceremonies and rituals to include the custom of sati, or widow burning. So, now we know where these stereotypes of India's land where they still burn their widows, and the practice of sati, how this is circulated in the West, and how the origins of that discourse about India dating back to Tilly Kettle's paintings. Then we move to Johann Zoffany and Arthur Devis. In 1783, Johann Zoffany, and in 1785, Arthur Devis arrived in Madras. They both painted in oil, generally portraits of important local personages and their families. Fashionable oil paintings were, however, subject to deterioration due to the climate, and were frequently of large size and difficult to transport in July 1783. So, Zoffany went to Calcutta and quickly established himself, accepting a number of commissions. Portraits of Mrs. Hastings and Sir Elijah Impey proved particularly noteworthy. His style varied from an unaffected naturalism to a flamboyant conversation piece. In 1784, Zoffany also went to the court of Oudh, now located in Lucknow, for the first of 3 visits. As British artists viewed the Nawab as a likely source of riches, Zoffany also executed a number of portraits of him. He also completed 2 famous paintings capturing the sense of life at Lucknow, Colonel Mordaunt's Cock Match and Colonel Antoine Poller with his friends Claude Martin, John Womble, and the artists. A theme emerging from his works was regarded the inclusion of Indian scene in his works. This was particularly evident in Indian scenes he finished on his return to London, tiger hunting in the East Indies. So, this whole stereotype of tigers, snake charmers, elephants, we have to thank Johann, Zoffany and Tilly for these images. This was particularly evident in these scenes, but the painting I have here is by Devis, not by Devis. It's a painting of a gentleman and servant. So, we can see how only certain kind of individuals, Indian individuals, appeared in these paintings, which were dominated by landscape and monuments. Only certain kind of individuals with whom the British would have come into contact with were included in these paintings. The other Indians were excised from the frame. The other aspect is the Orientalization of the Indian female. As I said, this is part of this discourse of Orientalism, where the Oriental male is othered as primitive and savage, whereas the Oriental female is exoticized as beautiful and desirable. So, this factory of the harem, as someone calls it, has permeated understandings of gender, sexuality and identity of the Orient. The myth of the Oriental harem satisfied bourgeois appetites for both the exotic and the erotic by projecting them on the East and provided a moral justification for colonization. So, this idea of the female who is exoticized, who is considered as desirable, but also is seen as immoral, is used as to create this whole myth of decadence in the courts of the Mughal rulers, the idea, or the Hindu rulers, the images of decadence which are seen as justifying British rule and impositions, not imposition, but attempts to view them from the Victorian notes and models of morality. The harem in the 19th century was a symbol of Oriental decadence, corruption and tyranny. As a result of the confusion of the zenana with the harem, the zenana did not evoke ideas about family in the Western mind. So, the zenana is very different from the harem, because zenana is a private space where women, it's a female space, but which is hidden from the gaze of the Western traveler or the Western stranger. Since they did not have access to this space, they mapped the space of the harem with the zanana, which is a different space, because the zanana is the space of the family. Indian women living within the zanana system were believed to be sexual temptresses, enslaved by the whims of a despotic, decadent males. So, this othering of the male as despotic and decadent, particularly the kings and rulers, impressions popularized in Western art and literature. These misguided impressions informed how Indian men and women were perceived by the British, who upon their colonization in India in 1858 sought to reform their allegedly deviant Indian subjects. So, while it fascinated them, the ambivalence explained that while many of the British administrators or painters or artists were fascinated by the Orient, they saw it as they exoticized and romanticized it. It also created a crisis because it challenged Western, particularly Victorian notions of morality, and they used this idea of a decadent East to justify their rule over to reform their rule as an attempt to reform their deviant Indian subjects, particularly in the domestic sphere, to obtain compliance with English values. So, now this is Dominique Ingres and John Frederick Lewis. They talk about the Oriental we look at the European painters, 19th century European painters. They look at the allure of the harem, which proved very lucrative for them. They capitalized on the harem myth and established its eroticized presentation. So, we are looking at India through the European male gaze, and we are looking at Indian women, Oriental women, through the European male gaze. So, and these capitalized on the harem myth and established as eroticized representation, producing the European male and female gaze. Depictions of For the European male and female gaze, depictions of Eastern women as alluring and rapacious sirens, while popular literature told harem tales of male indulgence, female subjugation, and generally deviant behavior of the Oriental other. From here we move to it's not just European artists, but also American artists like the Edwin Lord Weeks, who traveled to India in 1896. The end of his second trip to India, he wrote From the Black Sea through Persia and India. It was a travel account that, packed with his illustrations, detailed his journey around Asia. A change in his original travel plans because of the civil war in Afghanistan and a cholera outbreak had meant that he had to travel first on camelback and then on horses from Turkey to Persia, following the old caravan route, the Silk route, till he reached Bushire on the Persian Gulf. Here he boarded a steamer for Karachi, traveling via Aden and Muscat before moving on to Bombay. So we have these images created by Weeks. And then we have a French, we have another European traveler who lived in Algeria and Egypt in 1905, Georges Gasté, who settled in North India, making it the subject of his paintings and photos. His Indian paintings were exhibited at Orientalist saloons from 1906, receiving rave reviews. The artist with a wild nature and who tried throughout his life to run away from the spotlight then became in 1907 the official correspondent of the Orientalist Printers Society in India. In 1908, after a trip to Venice and then to Constantinople, following the steps of Perelotti, he returned to India to unravel the mysteries of this country. So there is also a continuity in the representation by European travelers who first traveled to the Middle East, Persia and the Arabian countries, and then traveled to India. So there is a continuity between the construction of this Orientalist discourse that Said mentioned, in which the Arab is seen as the other, and the representation of India, because they are part of these travels of these itinerant European artists who move from one part of the Orient to another and use the same style and the same modes of representation in representing different parts of the Orient, thus making them similar to one another even when they are not. From painting we move on to the discourse of photography, which again replicates or borrows the perspectival view of painting. It also uses the monocular view of West European landscape painting, and it replicates or reiterates the way it frames Indian landscapes. It reiterates that those stereotypes of the Indian landscape and people created by the European painters earlier in the 18th century. So this idea of nature as pristine, uncorrupted is replicated in Bone's view on the Dal Canal in Srinagar. We can see how nature looks uncorrupted. And then it's also Bone's image of ladies in Kashmir in India in 1865, which consists of royals and servants. You can see again how this repeats those tropes of painting. And then we have again Bone's painting of the Maharaja of Patiala and his attendants, and the Raja of Jamnagar, of Ratlam, the Raja of Ratlam. Okay. And then we have Dr. John Murray's view of the Taj Mahal in Agra, India in 1856. It's a view of the Taj from the east, and then we have another, sorry, I have mixed up the labels. This is again his image of Taj Mahal, John Murray's image of the Taj Mahal. And we have Captain Linnaeus photograph of the Naik's Choltri side veranda from the west in Madurai. We have Felix Beato's view of the Jantar Mantar in Delhi. and Captain Innes a view of the pagoda in Tanjore, a southern view in 1858. So, all these photographs replicate the tropes which were inaugurated by European landscape painting. And we have other monuments, not just Hindu monuments, but also Muslim monuments. We have these images of the Taj, or the images of Sikandrabad after the Indian Mutiny. At the turn of the century, now we come to the 20th century, and we find the turn of the 20th century, India seemed to be everywhere, even in US consumer culture. One of the earliest Orientalist fantasy images to enter into the American mass culture was that of a Maharaja, Sultan or Amir smoking a hookah surrounded by dancing harem girls. So, this stereotype was produced and carried over into the 20th century. Earlier in the 19th century, the image had been the subject of British, French and American Orientalist paintings. By the turn of the century, scenes of Oriental harems and palaces turned up in advertisements, on picture postcards and on the covers of Tin Pan Alley sheet music. The sexualized figure of the Eastern dancing girl appeared in spaces of high and low culture alike. The dancer Little Egypt became a national sensation after performing at the Chicago World's Fair. Isadora Duncan performed her adaptation of the Rubaiyat of Umar Khayyam barefoot and flowing robes for the elite women of Newport, Rhode Island. Ruth St. Denis danced in Indian knot style in a sari and gold jewelry on a Broadway stage, while Oriental dancers of various backgrounds performed in the nation's brothels and burlesque. So, I see this continuation of the discourse from the 18th century to the beginning of the to the end of the turn of the 20th century, and I'll close by showing how these images, these visual representations of India produced by landscape painting and photography are replicated in Orientalist fiction, and for lack lack of time, I would focus only on two writers, excuse me, two well-known writers in English, namely Rudyard Kipling and E.M. Forster. I juxtapose the two authors together because it is Rudyard Kipling who largely contributed to the Orientalizing or creating the Orientalist myth or the figure of the Oriental in his novels, and similarly E.M. Forster in several of his novels contributed to the same mystique of India. Now, they are seen as examples of benevolent Indian white men. Benevolent white men, somebody like Kipling, who grew up in India and who was tended by his Indian servants, who had a deep affection for his servants, but who did not come into contact with ordinary Indian people. So, his characters are generally from that class, and that same mix of love and hate, ambivalence, fascination and horror that we find in painting, it's expressed in verbal form in the writings of Kipling. And Forster, though he is believed to have tried to reverse the Orientalist myth, subscribes to it himself in his own fiction. So, I'll read some representative quotes from Kipling. For instance, this well-known quote about "Oh, East is East and West is East, West, and never the twain shall meet." So, this polarity of the East and the West, and how they are antithetical to one another, it's best put in this quote from Kipling in his Ballad of East and West. And the idea of the inscrutable Oriental, my experience is that one can never fathom the Oriental mind. And then he says that, this is Kim, dynamite was milky and innocuous beside that report of C-25. And even an Oriental, with an Oriental's views of the value of time, could see that the sooner it was in the proper hands, the better. In another quote from Kim, that would have been a fatal blow on Kim's character if Mahbub had not known that to others, for his own ends or Mahbub's business, Kim could lie like an Oriental. So, this idea of an Oriental as sly, cunning, liar, who is inscrutable, mysterious, who one can never understand. This is best represented in Kipling's fiction. Similarly, the ambivalence of the West towards the East, the rich cultures, superior civilizations, and ancient wisdom of the Orient have inspired many Westerners, but on the other hand, the threats of its monstrous mysteries and absurd religions hailing from its stagnant past have abhorred at least as many. For many, the Orient has been a dominion of hordes and despots or spiritual mystics and exotic sensuality. Exaggeration and imagination, together with a range of both positive and negative stereotypes connected to popular prejudices, have been essential to these views. This is what Clark says. So, there is a stereotyping and exaggeration which is both positive and negative. There is an exoticization and romanticization, and there is also a negation. Encountering the East has been significant for the self-image of the West, producing identities ranging from decadent European modernity to concepts of cultural, racial, and moral superiority. So, with Forster, we conclude this module and this unit in the module, who can be considered as an Orientalist in the 20th century literature of England, since his contentions about India, reflected in the fictions written before A Passage of India, carry the same Orientalist stereotypes against the Orientals, similar to Kipling. In some of his fictions, he represented colonial and imperial themes and set the locations of some of them over the borders of England in countries like Egypt and India, or characterized figures who wished to experience other. However, after experiencing the social atmosphere of India, this country becomes one of Forster's salient settings. Some of his short stories and his last and most well-known novel, A Passage to India, is located in India, and it's believed to be different from the earlier Orientalist novels. With that, we close this unit in Orientalism and Neo-Orientalism, and we'll move on to how Neo-Orientalism has emerged towards the end of the 1990s, or maybe around that time, which can be seen as Orientalism in a new form.